A few months ago, Netflix released a documentary series on notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. The documentary was directed by a man named Joe, and it was met with a lot of praise. It was a pretty well-made, well-documented series. It was very informative, and I thought it was pretty dang good. And the director of that has made a movie about Ted Bundy, so this guy has a fascination with him. And that movie is called Extremely Wicked, Extremely Wicked, Incredibly Evil, and Vile.
Do you remember the night we met?
I really expected this movie to do something interesting, to be informative, to be something, and it isn't anything. This movie is shockingly sparse, and the biggest issue I have with it is that there is literally no structure to this. It's very clear that the director of this movie is a documentarian because this movie has literally no structure. There are a few things that are set up with payoffs later, which is filmmaking 101, but there is no discernible acts in this movie. Things just happen as if it were a documentary. It feels like he was trying to show the chronological series of events that happened, and yet he doesn't really show what happens. It's very strange. The first 30 minutes of this movie are so confusing. It doesn't really set up anything that's interesting. It doesn't set up any interesting characters. It doesn't set up any interesting plot lines. It's just Zac Efron, who then meets Lily Collins, and then they start dating, and then he is almost immediately arrested and put in prison. Within the first 10 minutes, Ted Bundy is in prison. And if you know anything about him, you know that he committed tons of crimes in Seattle and the police were baffled by it. They had no idea who could have done this or how they could have done this because serial killers were not a thing back when Ted Bundy was doing his thing. This was so new to the world that it sent a shock throughout the entire United States, and no one knew how to handle it. And none of that is in this movie. It's just completely stripped out.
For years, I've carried this guilt that I'm to blame for everything. If only I hadn't trusted you.
And I could understand that if he was taking a character approach, as it seems he wanted to, but the characters are so poorly developed and the structure is so out of order and all over the place that none of it works. I wanted to see some of that, where he's doing his thing and no one knows what's going on and he's just like, hey, I'm gonna keep doing this if no one can stop me. But it doesn't. It instead takes the perspective of Lily Collins for a fair amount of this movie, and then it will take Zac Efron's, or Ted Bundy's, perspective for other parts of the movie, so it doesn't feel focused on either one, and in doing this, you don't feel like you have a grip on what they're doing or what the other person is doing. So it constantly is cutting in between these two people's lives, but you don't feel like you get a sense of who they are ever, because it's constantly cutting back and forth. If you wanted to focus on Lily Collins' character, then do that. Make it all from her perspective. Show how she was dealing with the scare of all these girls being killed. Show how Ted Bundy swept in and swept her off her feet, and their love between the two of them, how they were actually connected. Show this stuff that actually establishes character so that we can understand her perspective, so that we can understand what makes her tick, and so that we can see the connection that they have. The movie just keeps implying that these two have a bond, but it never really showed it. It just says these two are in love, so they are bound together. But in reality, the movie shows 5 minutes of them kissing and sleeping on the same bed and Zac Efron cooking breakfast, and then he just gets arrested. That's not enough time to establish a bond between characters, so that's a big issue. The focus of this movie is a huge issue, and that really affects the pacing, because when we're focusing on Zac Efron, it's such a boring character. Like, Ted Bundy, the way he's perceived in this movie is so boring. It's just one note throughout the whole movie. He's just constantly saying, I didn't do this, I'm innocent, and you never see him do anything. So if somebody were coming in to watch this movie, they might actually think that that's real. Like, this guy, he didn't do anything. The police are forcing evidence on him. He didn't do anything, because you never see him do anything. So you go, okay, this guy's kind of, there's nothing to him. He just is in love, and he may or may not have done some bad things that we never got to see. So he's boring in one note, and then when it cuts back to Lily Collins, she's also boring in one note, because all it seems like she does throughout the movie is mope around, cry, and be depressed about Ted Bundy being in prison or something. You don't understand her, you don't understand Ted Bundy, you don't understand any character in this. It's so baffling.
It's about another missing girl, isn't it?
Ted, did you do it?
No.
And there is even a great, really satisfying ending here that is completely wasted by these characters not being developed enough. When Lily Collins goes to confront Ted Bundy before he is sent to the electric chair, she says, I have been in your grip since I met you. I have carried your guilt. I want to know if you actually killed these people. You have to free me of this guilt that I'm carrying around with me, because I called the police and gave them your name in connection with some of the girls because a police sketch looked kind of like you, and I feel guilty about that, and I feel guilty if you had killed the girls that I didn't do it sooner, so you need to free me. Did you actually kill these girls? Is it your fault? And he keeps saying, no, 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 and she keeps pressuring him, and then she shows him a picture of a girl's decapitated body, and she asks, what did you do to the head? What happened to the head? And he finally writes hacksaw on the little windows separating themselves in the prison, and I felt like that was an incredibly satisfying way to end the movie. I loved that ending, but the problem is the characters just aren't interesting. You don't get either one's perspective enough to really feel the satisfying nature or the horror of this reveal. If you had just constantly followed Lily Collins and learned about her and learned what made her tick and seen that she called in his name and then felt guilty for her and been there with her the whole time, then this ending of him writing hacksaw and then the dawning realization of him actually being the killer, that would have been such a satisfying ending. Or if you had followed him and he had duped the world and I'm innocent, and you know that he's not, and then he finally reveals it, it would have been like a weight off the shoulders, like, oh, finally he says it, oh, and it's so satisfying from either perspective. It's just not executed well. Everything with this movie is frustrating. Even the stuff that works has its drawbacks, like the actual filmmaking, the cinematography looks fine, but there are a lot of shots that don't make sense. Like, he'll have a shot from inside a door and it will kind of like wobble over to the other side of the door, showing the shot with the windows, but it's so poorly done that it's just distracting, or the constant bad editing. There are some hard cuts I like, but there are some that are so jarring and unnecessary. And even though Zac Efron is a perfect cast for this movie with his charisma, there's so many scenes where it's like he feels like he's trying too hard. He feels like he's going for an Oscar moment. So, I don't know, this movie just doesn't really work for me on any level. I think there is something here. I think there is something that could have been shaped into something really great, but the director is so clearly out of his element. He's so clearly better at making documentaries, and he tried to kind of push the documentary filmmaking mentality on this movie, and it just doesn't work at all. So I'd probably give it a 3 out of 10, maybe a 2. I don't know. It's not for me. So that's it. I'll see you later. Today, tragedy struck. Behind this plain-looking door is a bedroom of YouTube superstar Rendan Lovell, who was wheeled out just earlier today when he was stricken by a fatal aneurysm. He was a film reviewer here on YouTube, much adored by the community that he had built therein. And if you were to ask this reporter about him, I would say that he got ahead of himself editing his latest video. Back to you, Craig.